This is gonna flip your perspective. The rise of identity politics as a means to atone for the past is doing a reverse today, and there's no more egregious term it has birthed than the idea of a blanket white privilege in history. Douglas Murray's had enough of that because the clip you're about to see is the most unapologetic pushback against intersectional identity politics that I've seen in a long time. Just take a look for yourself before I tell you more about it.
So what would you say to someone who said, because you acknowledge that perhaps we painted history in a jingoistic way previously and we're working towards making it more honest, an honest representation of history. But what would you say to someone who would say, well, this is the moment when kind of ethnic minority people, women, LGBT people are now getting their fair hearing, and that this is just people that are very uncomfortable with having that increased representation reacting against that?
Well, I mean, the first thing is, I do think a lot of people who make those claims need to know more. I'm getting rather fed up of people who've only just discovered things, presenting it as if everybody else is as ignorant as them. Like, some of us happen to know a lot of female writers before the year 2020. Some of us can think of an awful lot of very talented and brilliant black figures from before today. Some of us happen to know that there have been very prominent gay figures who existed before 2020. And I'm sort of startled at how much people give themselves away when they present it as if this is all new. Now, is it true that certain figures and certain voices were not heard as much in the past? Sure. But you can play that game almost irreducibly.
And that's exactly the problem with intersectional liberal worldview. In order to construe something as a white privilege, it needs to offer its own reading of history that at least goes back far enough for the term to even make sense. And yet upon first inspection from a more historical context, you realize that the term is just as hollow as the idea of the historical reading of gender relations as a patriarchy. Just as half the human population didn't oppress the other half on a gender basis, there was no notion of white privilege that made life easier for a farmer tilling land for his feudal lord in the 15th century under the scorching sun just to survive. For the longest time, the true divider between humans has been power, wealth, and influence. And the lower and oppressed class has always thought of itself as powerless rather than primarily white or male. So when Douglas Murray offers that reality check to the modern intersectional left, the notion of white privilege kind of crumbles, and here's something interesting. When that idea is imported into the academia or arts, there's almost a degree of condescension you feel when creatives and artists from women to minority racial groups are boxed up into one side and given special attention, rather than being made part of the total canon of contemporary art and literature. That's not just what you see with things like Black History Month, but also the shallow corporate virtue signaling you see from places like Netflix offering a separation section for Black stories or bookstores having dedication African American shelves. All those stories and books are supposed to merge into a united canon because they will be celebrated as they are, and yet they've strayed so far from the original intention of retrospectively acknowledging the contributions of people that didn't get the chance to do it in history. That's because they're not just limited to women or racial minorities, but nearly everyone.
Another thing worth pointing out, Nat, is there are a lot of lines we don't play that along now. For instance, you can very easily say that the history of literature and politics has to a considerable degree underrepresented the working class. You can see that in almost every country. Let's go a little further down that road. You can certainly say that people who are illiterate have been not well represented throughout history, or people born to the worst imaginable circumstances, irrespective of any other issue, have been poorly represented in literature, government, and so on. There are lots of ways in which we could do this. Now, the way in which we've decided to focus on it, for all sorts of reasons at the moment, is let's focus on it on gender, race, and sexuality. But, I mean, history was a mess for almost everyone. You know, it's one of the reasons why I revolt at the impression given that, for instance, white privilege existed throughout the past, and it was something that excluded back then. Most people in this country did not have an easy 14th century or 15th century or any other century up to the present. You know, you only have to go 2 generations back to people who, you know, didn't have basic sanitation in this country. In our own lifetimes, 1 in 5 people were leaving British schools functionally illiterate. So there's a lot of problems we can identify.
There certainly is, and that holds true even if you look at the world today. While the intersectional left looks for injustices on the basis of race and gender, it has forgotten its true place as standing for the poor and working class. And you see a pretty dismal situation there if you look at it from the leftist lens. For example, in the United States today, working middle-class Americans make up half the total population, and yet statistically, less than 2% of people from that working class have ever been able to make it into the halls of Congress across America's history. We can debate which racial or gender group you want part of that 2% or not, but it ultimately still leaves out the 98% that seldom ever form the conversation for the modern left. It's said that history is always written by the victor. It's also true that history is created by people that hold the power. That means that while the modern left is fixated on things like race and gender inequalities in history, it is missing the forest for the trees for the very real inequalities in power and influence that exist today between the rich and the poor.
We need to have this understanding in the round. And I worry that we are focusing on specific parts of it, and furthermore, we're focusing on specific parts of it without solving it. I mean, you must feel this as well. We our society at the moment is like the Eye of Sauron. We go on to things, we focus on them, but we make them worse. You know, I wouldn't mind if all of this was simply bringing out voices that have been not heard enough from the past. By the way, so there's an academic point to make on this. This was originally the point in black studies, gay studies, and women's studies. The original idea is a pretty good one as an academic discipline. It's to say, in the past, there were, I mean, George Eliot. There was a reason why George Eliot had to write under that name. But so you can play, you can definitely play this exercise of saying there were women in the past who were not read enough or had to disguise who they were, and let's therefore return to them now and bring those voices back up. That seems to me to be a very noble academic enterprise, and a noble enterprise in other ways. You can do the same thing with gay figures in the past, and you can certainly do the same thing with black figures in the past. That seems to me to be a very, very worthwhile enterprise. Here's the moment where it starts to divide. It starts to divide when those people are already in the canon. They are not black literature, gay literature, women's literature, they're literature. They're not black history, gay history, women's history, they're history. And one thing, and I focus on this in the studies thing, because it's so interesting that what has ended up happening, instead of allowing these figures to become part of that and remain part of that, they suddenly are back to being in the special interest shelves. And that seems to me an epitome of what I would have thought we wouldn't want.
Douglas Murray put his finger on the problem so clearly. There's a massive difference between history and today, and there's a massive difference between recognizing the parts of a unified whole that make up things like literature and art versus breaking down the unified whole into groups based on superficial identity. That conflation is where the modern left has gone wrong in interpreting history and artistic enterprise while diluting its meaning in the process. It commits the fallacy of composition with words like white privilege and patriarchy, and makes out truly oppressed people in history who may even be white or male as the oppressors based on a shallow modern and intersectional reading, and it's a sad reflection that Douglas Murray himself saying this is still not free from the burden of those superficial identities in the eyes of the modern left. And I think that's where you see a microcosm of what happens when you try to silence or magnify people's voices to create output today based on their race or gender. Apart from this approach, putting too much trust and faith in the people that it gives that power, it only ends up looking embarrassingly out of touch with reality.